This video is going to talk about the reasons why each region of the United States is going to be economically, socially, and politically very different from each other. And for us to understand why they're going to be like that and why their differences are going to cause a giant conflict like the Civil War, we have to go all the way back to when we first began learning about all this stuff in the colonies. The North, why the North couldn't farm was because of their rocky soil and that they couldn't farm anything because it was too cold. So they had to go to things like merchants and shipping and lumber and trade. They couldn't because they couldn't farm. And so their geographical differences are going to be a giant cause for why they're going to stay industrialized. Whereas the South, they had fertile soil, and so they could plant and grow things, and they started to grow things of cash crops like tobacco and indigo and rice, and now in the 1800s they're going to start to cultivate cotton. So their geographical differences between the North is going to cause them to kind of separate from that region. And the West, as we're exploring West and moving West, there really is a lot of fertile soil out there for people to farm on, but there's also raw materials and things like gold and silver, not really silver, but a lot of gold, so they can go and mine that as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about should be complete review for the economy of the North, the South, and the West. For the North, we know the economy is mainly going to be industry, and they're going to use that through building of factories, and they're going to manufacture goods. They're going to be giant in trade and shipping, and they're going to be trading and shipping all of the raw materials that the South is going to provide for them. The main things you need to know about that are the Erie Canal. They're going to have steamboats, and they're going to use railroads to do all that. They're going to use a lot of immigrants as their labor force, so they are going to have paid labor. It's not going to be very much, or any at all, really. But the immigrants are going to be the main working force there. And typically, in the 1800s, we're going to get a giant influx of German and Irish immigrants coming in. Now, they're going to have very few slaves, but they're not against slavery. They just don't have any up there. And so if you're not surrounded by slaves all the time, you're not going to understand the big giant issue of slavery. You just, if you don't see it, if you don't hear it, if you don't know about it, then you kind of just forget about it. So the big things you have to remember are how these inventions are going to cause industry to rise. We have factories and manufactured goods in industry. They're going to use paid labor with immigrants and German and Irish immigrants to basically fund and give supply to the factories for work. The South economy is going to be strictly on agriculture. And they're going to focus on agriculture with large plantations with the use of slave labor. They're also going to have small farms without slave labor. Now, the South is really going to rely on slave labor to farm their raw materials. And the reason why slave labor is so important is because with the invention, the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin is going to expand slavery. At this point in 1800s, slavery was almost on a downhill. It's been outlawed in European nations for about 20 years now. Slave trade is illegal internationally. So slaves were almost on the downhill. In the North, were the reasons why they haven't really done anything about slavery yet is because, one, they were relying on the raw materials, and two, they thought it was just going to go away. And a lot of the founding fathers thought that slavery was just going to go away. They kicked that. The phrase of kicking that issue down the line is going to be used a lot because they just didn't want to deal with it at the time, and it wasn't causing a huge deal like disruption, and so they just thought it was going to go away. But with the cotton gin, it's going to expand slavery because the cotton gin made it faster for cotton to be separated from the sticky seeds, which means that they can give up more slaves. One slave in one day would take an entire day to pick a pound of cotton. Well, now with the cotton gin, they can have 10 pounds of cotton within an hour. And so they can use those slaves to go and work more fields so they can expand their cotton growth, and with that expand slavery. They're going to produce cash crops. And the main one of this time is going to be the cotton. Now, they're going to have these produce their cash crops, and the cotton is going to go to the north to become the manufactured goods. So now these guys are consumers of manufactured goods from the north. So these guys rely on each other. They need the manufactured goods from the north, and the north needs the raw materials from the south to make the manufactured goods. The first industry that's going to rise in the north is going to be textile industries, which they're going to use the cotton from the south to make them. And for the manufactured goods, they wanted them cheap. So if they're going to get them cheap, they're going to have to keep their cash crops cheap. And they can do that because they're not paying anyone to work on the fields. Now the West, their economy is mostly going to be agricultural. It's mostly small farms. They're all moving west. It's very culturalized at this point, and so they're just moving west to farm. So that's the economy. So we have industry, large plantations with slave labor, or we have small farms, strictly agriculture, and the West is mostly going to be agricultural. Now we're moving on to the social aspects. For the North, for the North, it's going to be different from the South and the West, because the North is going to have a very diverse population due to all of the immigrants coming in. We're going to have multiple languages. We're going to have multiple society and traditions, and people are going to either embrace it or they're going to reject it. And so now we have a problem between what's called nativists and versus immigrants. So we have nativists saying, okay, immigrants need to not come in the United States because they're taking all of our jobs, and so obviously they are going to reject those immigrants coming in. Now, slavery did not really impact society very well, or very much. They have very little slaves in the North, and free men, and for that matter, in the North. And so they're not making any laws to cater to slavery in the North. And once again, if you don't see it, if you don't hear it, if you aren't surrounded by it, you just forget it's kind of there. But the main thing that the South or the North is going to do differently is they're going to provide some public education. Now, they don't do this out of the goodness of their hearts because they want everyone to be educated. They have to assimilate immigrants. Now, assimilate means to make like them, and so they have to make sure the immigrants can speak English and to know the cultures and the traditions of the United States so they can work the machines and not get into a lot of trouble that way. Now, the South, their society is going to be run by the privileged class. Now, the privileged class is going to be made up of large plantation owners. So the society, not only society, but also society and government. Because you had to have a certain amount of land to participate in government, and they're going to keep that land so large, and so only the large plantation owners can participate. But that's a small percent. This privileged class is a small percent of the society. So this is a situation where we have a small percent of society running the whole town, or the whole, basically, region, whereas most people living in the South will have small farms and no slaves. Now, this, you should hear some ominous music in the background, because this is going to be a large reason for a large problem for the South during the Civil War. Now, slaves will affect society here. The South saw slavery as a positive good. They're saying, look, we're giving these people a house, giving these slaves a house and food and a family, and we're taking them from their the tribal ways of barbarism, and they're living better than the immigrants up north. So they really thought that they were doing a positive good for society, which we all know is wrong. Now, they had no public education down there either, because it was illegal to educate African Americans, because they were scared of slave uprisings, because the population of slaves definitely outnumbered the populations of whites. And so when you have that many people, you want to keep them illiterate so they can't read to escape, or they can't read and organize. And provided no public education to anyone. So the only people that could get educations are the rich people, and they can either hire private tutors, or typically they'll send the males off to military school. So all education was private. So if you can afford it, you got it. Now in the West, their society, it's very underdeveloped. That further education was only really what your family could provide. So because they're out in the West, they're not bringing a whole lot of society with them. Now, for their political and their politics, this is where it's going to get a little dirty dealings here, because we're talking about politics, and so we're only dealing with the representatives from each state and each region. So the North in politics, this goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson versus vice versa problem. So they're going to favor the national bank and protective tariffs. Now, they're going to favor the national bank because the national bank favors industry, and they're going to like protective tariffs because that protects them from foreign competition. Remember, protective tariffs makes the prices of foreign competition coming over to rise, causing people to want to buy American-made products, keep those prices low. Problem is, if we do it to the foreign countries coming in, the foreign countries are definitely going to do that to us going out. And so the South is not going to like this protective tariff. In just a second, I will explain why. Big thing here, though, is the Erie Canal, because that can go from the east to the west in the Great Lakes, is going to strengthen, whoops, how do I spell strengthen? Forgot the N. Strengthen relations between the Northeast and the Northwest, because now we have a trade route with them, and that can open up opportunities in trade. Now the South is going to completely oppose the national bank because it favored the North and the industries, and they're also going to oppose the protective tariff because their raw materials are going to those foreign countries, and those foreign countries are going to put a protective tariff on their goods, which is not going to be what they want, because they're going to have to raise their prices. No one's going to buy their goods, and their economy is going to go down. So they do not like that, and in fact, they're going to use nullification, where they can ignore the protective tariff laws. And that's when Jackson made the force bill to force South Carolina to abide by the protective tariff, and they said no, we threatened to secede, and so that whole situation happened because of the protective tariff. They didn't like internal improvements. They didn't like those things because it favored the North, and they supported cheap loans because they were moving west. Remember, they had to move west because of their soil problem. They were depleting all those nutrients out of the soil, so they had to move west. And so they support the cheap land loans situation with the Homestead Act. Now, the West is fairly new to the situation, and so they need stuff in the West that only the North and the South can provide. So if you were in the middle, you would favor some in the North and some in the South to get what you wanted. So the West is going to oppose national bank so they can get cheap loans for land west. And so if they want cheap loans, they're going to side with the South here. Now, if they want roads and canals, they're going to accept the protective tariff. In exchange for what the North can give them. So they can, they're playing both sides. So they're going to accept the protective tariff to make the North happy, so they can get roads and canals built by the North to go west. And so the West is going to play both sides here, which is going to be smart, because the North is going to need votes to get the protective tariff passed, and they can get that from the West. And the South is going to need votes to oppose the national bank. They're going to get that from the West. So real quick recap already. We already know the industry is going to be mostly in the North. Nope, that's not industry. There we go. Industry is going to be in the North with trading and shipping, and the agriculture is going to be in the South with cash crops, specifically cotton. The West are just going to have small farms and mostly agriculture. The social differences, we are going to have provided public education to assimilate the immigrants. They're going to have a diverse population because of the immigrants. The South is going to make education completely illegal. They don't offer it to anybody, so only if you were rich, you could afford any education whatsoever. Most of the people living on the farms are going to be not having slaves because they're in their small farms. And small population is going to be running the whole South, which is through the privileged class, landowners, large plantation owners. In the West, the education is only going to be what's provided by the family. Now, in politics, the North is going to favor the national bank protective tariffs because that helps industries. They like the Erie Canal. It's going to strengthen the relationship between the North and the West, which you should see here. The South is going to oppose the national bank, oppose the protective tariffs because it helps the North. They're going to use that through nullification, which they can ignore the law if they feel it's unconstitutional. They're going to oppose internal improvements because it favors the North, but they're going to support cheap land grants because they're moving west and they need land. The West is going to do what they need to do to get the stuff that they need out west, which is they're going to oppose the national bank to get the cheap lands from state banks, and they're going to accept the protective tariff and the, in exchange for North building roads and canals out west.